Hello and welcome back to the UKSIF Leadership Podcast and our 12 Days of UKSIF-mas series, where we have spent the last 12 days breaking down what we've been working on, big moves and big news in the sustainable finance sector. I'm Sally and today I'm joined by James. As the listener may be able to hear, I'm beginning to lose my voice, but this is the final day of UKSIF-mas where we will be covering 12 days of COP29. James, thanks for joining me.
No worries. This is the reality of doing this during Christmas party season when we've all got colds.
So let's dive straight in. James, can you take us through a bit of what is COP?
Yeah, so the COP stands for the Conference of the Parties, and in the context of what we're talking about, it's the Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. There is another COP that people have heard of. That COP is COP16, which took place this year. That's the Conference of Parties on the Nature and Biodiversity Framework. But for today's purpose, we're going to talk about the climate change. What's typically called the climate COP, as opposed to the nature COP, and it brings together countries from across the world to progress and to deal with climate change and to talk about how to make an agreement ultimately between countries on addressing climate change. The host country designates and alternates between continents and countries, and so the UN, in its normal way, has a framework and an approach to figuring out who's going to be hosting it. And this year it was the choice of Eastern Europe. But one of the downsides of COP is it requires every single country to agree to everything, including every country agreeing to be where the next host is going to be. A number of countries put themselves forward last year that Russia wasn't very happy with. A number of proposals from Russia weren't met with positive approval from other parts of the world, and Azerbaijan was seen as a middle ground that everybody could agree with, and that's why the COP this year was hosted in Baku. In the past, good things have come out of COP. Of course, we've had the Paris Agreement. That was COP21, and actually the UK hosted COP26. Technically, it was the UK and Italy that co-hosted COP26, but it took place in Glasgow in Scotland a few years ago, and that's where the UK government announced that we wanted to be the world's first net zero financial centre, which has actually led to a huge piece of work for UKSIF, and you can still read our net zero inquiry report on our website.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. And I think you touched on some things there that take us nicely into the biggest problems that COP is facing. I mean, with Azerbaijan hosting COP29, we've now seen 2 fossil fuel states in a row hosting COP. Lobbyists are having a field day trying to detach emissions from fossil fuels for obvious reasons if you're based in a fossil fuel state. And it's amazing to have a treaty about carbon emissions where you're not allowed to talk about fossil fuels. And proportionally, this year, we saw the highest number of oil and gas lobbyists present at COP, while organizations like ourselves and other people in the space are unable to get passes to the actual conference. They are trying to focus the conversation on carbon capture and other ways of limiting, offsetting and mitigating emissions without talking about fossil fuels. And Mark Campagnoli, a good friend of UKSIF, said about COP28 at our leadership summit last year that it was like having a conference about quitting smoking where you are not allowed to mention cigarettes. But that's just how powerful the lobby is. And on top of that, as you touched on it there in the intro, it's also a bureaucratic nightmare. Everyone has to agree on everything, and it makes it very hard to feel that you're sort of moving in the right direction as fast as you should be able to. This also leads to quite a bit of lack of trust in it, I think, from sort of broader business and population, if you agree.
Yeah, I do, and I think it's one of the biggest challenges that we face is the way that COP is structured and set up. But we cannot give up on an international dialogue around climate change and trying to get international agreements. I mean, the Paris Agreement has had some really positive things. The COP26 in Glasgow, I mentioned, also had GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Now, half of the world's financed emissions are covered by commitments, I suppose, to invest in net zero by 2050. And so there are powerful things that come out of it, but I think ultimately the way that COP is set up, it requires each country to be making their own commitments and doing their own actions, and that's reflective of the state of the world or the way the world works. We're divided as a world into countries. Countries are sovereign. Countries are keen to sign up to these deals, but ultimately the delivery of what they've committed to is by that specific country and their ongoing political, democratic, or otherwise processes. And so you do have to rely on those individual countries to be the ones that take forward them and deliver the commitments that they've made. Albeit that it's a global problem like climate change, we do need the world to come together to do it. But what it certainly is not is a kind of global policeman, which is creating laws for the world around carbon emissions. And COP's never going to be that. It's got to be individual countries, but that is why it's so important that we get countries together. And I think that what we saw in COP28, which was in Dubai and Abu Dhabi last year, was the first time there was mention of sort of scaling down fossil fuels. Some of that language around fossil fuels was removed this year. I think from what I hear, at the request of Saudi Arabia, which is obviously disappointing. And we know that, as you said, this is two petro states in a row that have now hosted COP, and that of course brings a whole lot of challenges. Not least, the government of Azerbaijan tried to use the talks to actually broker some oil and gas deals, which is about as ironic as it can be. The next COP will be, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the next COP is going to be in Brazil, also a state that has an enormous amount of oil and gas industry, but also, of course, a state that is doing an awful lot around the Amazon, and the actual city that it's going to be in, called Belém in the north of Brazil, is right in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. So it's going to hopefully change people's perspective once they're in the heart of the Amazon, seeing kind of some of the core climate, almost front lines in our climate change battle, and it should hopefully make people think about that much more efficiently and effectively. But not everything that's come out of COP is bad, or came out of COP29 is bad. We saw a consistent focus on the private sector as being absolutely crucial to achieving net zero. And obviously we've been at UKSIF beating that drum for a long time. We cannot just rely on governments. Equally, you cannot just rely on the private sector. Every actor must be doing everything they can be doing as quickly as they can, and arguably even more than that. And so even from the UK's perspective, we saw the City of London Corporation co-launching the Transition Finance Council with the UK government. We saw a historic breakthrough on what's called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. That's been a very long-standing kind of unresolved issue that's hindered the development of global carbon markets. And so there's now been a really important breakthrough on that, which is really positive. There's something called the New Collective Quantified Goal, the NCQG, which triples finance to developing nations, increasing the goal from $100 billion annually to $300 billion by 2035. Now, that is nowhere near what the developing nations asked for or need or wanted. They were looking at between $1 and $1.3 trillion a year. But it is, of course, a step up in the ambition, and should hopefully help. And then ourselves, in our role as my role as the chair of the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance, and UKSIF's role as the secretariat for that alliance, we actually launched a report at COP29, looking what we've called the Misaligned Incentives Report.
Thanks, James. It's good to hear about the positives that have come out of COP. The GSIA report on misaligned incentives, could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So this is something we're really proud of. And just a quick intro to GSIA. So it's the network or the umbrella network, I suppose, of SIFs from across the world. So, of course, there's UKSIF. There's also SIFs all across Europe, represented in GSIA under the EuroSIF umbrella. There's also SIFs in the US, in Canada, in Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. And we all get together. In fact, we most recently got together physically around the perimeters of the PRI in-person conference in Toronto. But we meet up and discuss online very frequently. We share ideas, experiences, thoughts about policy, what's happening in each country across the world, partly because there's no one else that knows what it actually is like to run and operate a SIF apart from the other SIFs. So we share a lot of insights. And we're increasingly active on the international stage, putting forward our policy thoughts and views, as well as every 2 years publishing our Global Sustainable Investment Review report, which looks at the size and nature of the sustainable finance market across the world. And so this year we thought, well, we need to get into the conversation, and the challenge that we've got, or that we're trying to address, is this idea that it's still, for a rational investor thinking rationally, is still unfortunately incentivized to invest in unsustainable activities, and that's a really significant challenge. And part of the problem is policy. Part of the problem is the way governments work. We've got things like subsidies that are driving investments in the wrong direction. We've got a lack of global carbon markets or carbon prices, and so there's a whole range of reasons that these investors are still incentivized in the wrong way, and these what we're calling misaligned incentives. And so some of the sort of key insights that we've put forward from this report: there are unmet commitments, and that means that governments have made bold commitments, which have led to financiers and corporates making bold commitments to close the climate investment gap and to advance technology around sustainability. But those pledges are insufficient without the robust policy support. And so on the back of governments making lots of commitments, we've seen investors make commitments. The governments then haven't delivered on their part of the commitments, particularly in the context of the Ukraine war, the cost of living crisis, the increased prices of oil and gas. And so as the government commitments have fallen down, so have the investor commitments, which were based on the back of that. And so policymakers often expect private capital to lead the way, but don't fully understand the complexities of investment decision-making processes. And so we have this really big problem where you've got governments that are trying to move things forward without understanding how decisions are made in the context of how investments are made. And so that's a misalignment. There's something that we've concluded exists, which is called the investor policymaker impasse. One set of commitments leads to another set of commitments. If those commitments are not then delivered, the other commitments start falling, and those inflated promises are not being realized. And so we created a new framework. We called it the Pivot Framework. It's an acronym. And I should give a big shout out to Mark Manning for coming up with a lot of this, and actually also Will Martindale and his team at Cambry who helped write this whole report. And so the Pivot Framework talks about the policy vacuum. That's the P of pivot, which is a lack of clear, consistent policies, and indeed clear lack of national transition plans as well. The I is for interest, or rather self-interest, which is the short-term focus, the narrow performance metrics, the focus on almost quarter by quarter financial returns rather than long-term returns, which is where we know a challenge like climate change is focused. Then there's valuation, or rather misvaluation, which is not adequately pricing climate risks and opportunities into financial models, but actually having COP next year in the Amazon is going to be a really core part of that valuation question, which is, why is the Amazon rainforest worth more when it's cut down and put into logs than when it's standing up, having a huge positive impact on global climate? So valuation is a key challenge there. Another problem, the O of pivot, is ownership, which is all about limited investor engagement on climate issues. How do we enhance our ownership models and our active ownership models, not just on individual asset by asset, but also systemic stewardship as well? And then finally, the T is transition misalignment, which is kind of the conflicts that exist between existing business models and climate goals. And so we've urged governments to start thinking about developing and implementing national transition plans, and of course biodiversity strategies as well, establishing the regulatory frameworks, the financial incentives and corporate transparency to promote sustainable investments, and fostering public-private collaboration. And this is where government needs to understand what is happening in the private sector, how investment decisions are made, but also understand where there are areas the market can't currently reach that the government can have a big impact on. So yeah, that's our guide or our report. We created 3 guides underneath it. One is a guide for COP29 negotiators, another is a guide for policymakers, and the final one is a guide for investors. And all of those are available to download on the GSIA website.
Brilliant. I'll also put it in the description of this episode as well for easy access for the listener. But James, what happens next? Obviously, it was launched at COP. Is this an ongoing thing? How are you taking it forward?
So yeah, next steps. We're really proud of the launch. We think we've got quite a lot of traction at the launch, but of course this isn't just about right now. This is an ongoing challenge of aligning policy with climate goals at both the international and the country by country level. So we're going to continue to push this. We're looking to try and be at COP next year to further push this message, where we're also hoping to publish next year the Global Sustainable Investment Review. So that'll be more data that can help back up the case for this, and to continue to just push this message that financial services cannot create the transition on their own, nor can corporates, nor can governments. We've all got to work together. We've got to understand each other. We've got to understand our motivators, and we've got to create the environment where things can happen in specific areas that we're working in. And that's the basic message of the report. So it's not just a report that gets launched once at COP and then that's it. It's a report that should hopefully live on long into the future. And we look forward to continue to work with policymakers as we progress this into the future.
And what's been the appetite from policymakers for your report and your sort of recommendations?
So the appetite's been good. I think the challenge, of course, with this year's COP, and we saw it before 8 years ago, is that Donald Trump was elected just before COP started. And so the shadow of, well, what does this mean for US commitments? What does this mean for where the world's gonna head if the US is not part of this process? Now, our view, of course, is, well, we want the US to remain as committed as possible. We know that in the previous Trump administration, the states, the regions, the cities, corporates all came back together to club together to say we are still in, no matter what the federal government says and does. But of course, the federal government is a hugely powerful and influential actor in this space, and the Biden administration has done a lot to convince other countries to do their bit and to move things forwards. But having said that, we can't despair. We've got to make sure that we keep moving forward. If one country isn't doing everything it can, then other countries need to step up further. And of course, this is where the narrative that we've been putting into the UK government is so vital. This is not just a cost on governments. This is the opportunity now for the UK, in our sense, to lead the transition to have the companies, the investments here in the UK that are going to drive the future of our economy, be the sustainable investment models of the future, and create that kind of global opportunity for capital that wants to invest in sustainable activities, which is loads of global capital, to come to the UK and invest in some great opportunities here. So you know, we know everyone's now got to work harder, work smarter, work faster, and we hope to see the US, returning to the climate conversation sooner rather than later. But in the meantime, we've all got to work as hard as we can.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. On that note, I want to thank everyone for tuning into our 12 Days of UKSIF-mas series. It's been hugely fun to organise and produce, and I hope our members and other supporters have enjoyed it. We'll be back very soon, so remember to like and subscribe and follow our socials to be the first to see new episodes from us. But that's all from us for now. Have a lovely festive period.